Hey everyone, my name is Lynx Kameli, and in this week's video I wanted to jump on the bandwagon of why I quit WoW videos, but give my unique perspective as a hardcore raider and someone who doesn't enjoy the typical FF14 hooks like the story. Perhaps you're a Mythic raider yourself and wondering if you'd enjoy raiding in FF14, or perhaps you're purely an FF14 player who wants to know how a hardcore raider finds enjoyment in the game. Either way, I often feel like these videos focus on the casual side of 14 and not so much the high-end raiding side. So here's why I quit Mythic raiding in WoW to raid in FF14. I'm a player whose enjoyment of FF14 comes almost solely from raiding, and have notoriously skipped all of the story content in 14, speedrunning to endgame, and reaching raiding as quickly as possible. This is a pretty uncommon gameplay style in FF14, with the main draws of the game being the story, the characters, the world, glamours, crafting, housing, and other forms of more casual content. This isn't to say I don't enjoy these parts of the game, and I don't look at skipping the story and rushing to endgame as some sort of badge of honor, but what I care about the most is endgame and high-end raiding. This probably sounds pretty familiar if you're a Mythic raider in World of Warcraft. What I'm here to tell you is that despite the game not catering to high-end raiders, there is still tons of enjoyment to be found and difficult challenges to overcome in Final Fantasy XIV raiding. An important part of FF14 raiding that is often not very well discussed is the issue of boss count in raiding. What I mean by this is that every Savage raid tier in Final Fantasy XIV has only 4 bosses, and this sounds like an incredibly low amount compared to WoW's 10 to 12 boss raids, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that we do actually get comparable boss counts per raid tier. It's just not all in Savage. You see, in World of Warcraft, raids are released as one complete piece of content, containing all of the bosses for a tier in one area. When a new raid in WoW is released, that is the raid, and aside from Mythic Plus, it's the only place you'll be facing new encounters. FF14 raids are broken up between 24-man raids, also known as Alliance raids, 8-man Extreme Trials, Savage raids, and Ultimates. There are 4 bosses per Alliance raid, 2 Extreme Trials per raid tier, 4 Savage bosses per tier, and depending on how you look at it, 1 or 4 bosses in Ultimate, bringing us to a total of 11 or 14 bosses per raid tier cycle. The reason I say Ultimate can be 1 or 4, depending on how you look at it, is that Ultimate raids are boss gauntlets that contain multiple bosses split up by phases inside of one fight, which is why Ultimate fights are generally upwards of 15 to 18 minutes for one encounter. With the raids being split up like this, you have a trade-off of having more diversity and variety in bosses, where they exist in the game, their design, and their arenas, with the drawback being less highly challenging encounters and a smaller pool of bosses that drop the best gear in the game. The last part there is the most important. When looking to acquire the best gear in the game, yes, you will only have the 4 Savage bosses to tackle, as Ultimates only exist as an extreme challenge, not rewarding better gear, but a transmog weapon and a title to show off your accomplishment. The diversity of raiding, though, means that outside of your weekly Savage raiding, you have many other pieces of content that you can take part in and still receive rewards that fuel your Savage and Ultimate raids. Alliance raids, in comparison to WoW, are around LFR to early normal mode difficulty, but reward coins which can be turned in for gear upgrade tokens, which are required to upgrade your gear to the highest level. These tokens also drop in Savage, so you don't have to do Alliance raids for them, but they're a good way to acquire them for your alt classes, or if you're getting unlucky and not receiving the upgrade tokens fast enough to keep up with your gear upgrades. Moving on to Extreme Trials, the next tier above Alliance raids, they are around early heroic boss difficulty, meaning that they are very often pugged and don't require voice comms or much commitment to farm them. These bosses drop high item level weapons, allowing you an avenue to acquire a near Savage raid level weapon much more easily than Savage raiding. Many high-end raiders actively progress these trials while also progressing the Savage raid tier, as the weapons from Extreme Trials can prove highly beneficial when progressing in Savage. They also drop mounts, so people farm these Extreme Trials throughout the entire expansion. This is a huge part of FF14 that I love, the fact that a new raid release does not invalidate the previous raids. Because there are cosmetics tied to the raids, like mounts and transmog items, people actively farm old content forever, and you can always go back and experience an older Extreme Trial with 7 others just for fun, or to get the mount or transmog, whatever reason you have for being there, you can find a group for it. Compare that to World of Warcraft, where a new raid release means all 10 or so bosses that you've been farming are now seemingly gone forever. There are some really fun raids in WoW that I would have loved to keep doing throughout an expansion just out of enjoyment, but because a new raid was released and better gear exists, nobody ran the old raids. Add on to that the fact that you can have every class in the game on one character in Final Fantasy XIV, meaning you can swap classes and roles whenever you want. Farming old bosses doesn't ever get boring. Maybe I want to tank an extreme trial today, or maybe I want to heal it. Maybe I've been trying to learn melee DPS and will practice on extreme trials to get good enough for Savage. This is one of the biggest replayability factors for high-end raiders such as myself. Moving on to Savage raids then, this is where the best gear in the game will come from, and where most of the challenging raid content lies. Savage difficulty is around N Heroic to late Mythic difficulty, with each boss being progressively more difficult than the last. While yes, WoW does have more Mythic bosses, if you've ever been in a decently progressed Mythic guild, you'll be aware of the fact that the first 5 to 7 bosses in a Mythic raid are much easier than the last 3. There is a sharp increase in difficulty near the end of a Mythic raid, whereas Savage is a constant progression of difficulty, meaning that no boss feels like a pushover. On top of that, FF bosses are also on average longer than Mythic bosses, averaging around 8 to 11 minutes per Savage fight, compared to WoW's 4 to 8 minute average. This longer fight duration also exists in extreme trials, so when looking at encounter time across an entire raid tier, FF might actually have more encounter time than WoW's despite having a lower boss count. This is of course made up by World of Warcraft having trash between its bosses, whereas FF14 doesn't, but boss fight time can be higher in FF14 depending on what you're looking at. This is another big reason as to why a hardcore raider can enjoy FF14, as despite a lower boss count, the bosses feel fuller and more complete, with many different phases and mechanics throughout the entire encounter. When moving on to Ultimate raids, it gets even crazier. Ultimate raids are, without a doubt, the hardest pieces of raiding content ever conceived in an MMO, aside from one-shots and just cheese bosses. I'm sure many long-term WoW players will scream about how wrong I am for saying that, with Nax Rammus being the hardest raid ever, or Sartharian 3 Drakes, or Mythic Gul'dan, Mythic Sargeras. How can an 8-man raid be harder than a 20-man raid? Listen, I've been there. I know how hard WoW fights can be. I know that the clear rates for end Mythic bosses are extremely low. But what I can tell you is that Mythic Unat is the only fight in WoW to ever compete with Ultimate raids in FF14 in terms of difficulty. And that raid was the least cleared Mythic raid in history. 8-man raids are so much harder than 20-man raids because with only 8 players, you can give those players extreme personal responsibility on a level you just cannot do with 20 people. 20 points of failure versus 8 points of failure. With a smaller amount of failure points, you can create harder individual challenges. Add on the fact that Ultimate raids can last up to 20 minutes with one mistake having the ability to cause a wipe and reset your progress back to the beginning, and oh man are these fights insanely difficult. You can point out clear dates and how many people clear Ultimates and say that they're easier than certain WoW bosses, but that's only because WoW bosses are gear gated and FF14 bosses are not. Ultimate raids are designed with players being best in slot, meaning they are 100% tailor-made to be incredibly difficult, and you cannot overgear them. Even when a new raid releases, Ultimate raids are item level synced, meaning if you come in with better gear later on, too bad, your stats get lowered to the level they were when the raid was released. 4 years after the first Ultimate was released, we still have thousands of players attempting them, and progressing for months hoping to get a clear. This is where high-end hardcore raiders live in Final Fantasy XIV. Ultimate raids have basically ruined other MMOs for me. Without the insane challenges of Ultimate, I just don't know how to have fun in an MMO anymore. I crave that insane challenge, the hours of wiping 15 minutes in and banging your head in frustration, and the immense satisfaction of finally overcoming the challenge and clearing an Ultimate. I have dozens of clears on these fights, and still enjoy doing them to this day. Some people have hundreds of clears of Ultimates, no longer needing the transmog rewards, but just doing them because the challenge is so fun. Even after your 20th clear, there is still a joy to be had in the amount of skill it requires to be cleared. When I say I enjoy FF14, that's mostly because I love Ultimate raids. Moving on from Ultimate, a huge reason I stick with FF14 over WoW as a competitive hardcore raider is the simplicity of gearing in FF14. I cannot tell you how liberating it felt to leave World of Warcraft and come over to FF14, and find out that there are actual best-in-slot lists that give me an extremely clear path of gear progression. I hated the RNG factor of gearing in WoW, with some pieces coming from Mythic Plus, meaning I would have to wait for my weekly vault and hope I get the highest item level version, and other pieces coming from raiding, but maybe they don't ever drop, or they go to other players, and I'm seemingly just pulling a slot machine hoping to get an upgrade. In stark comparison, FF14 gearing is completely deterministic. There are only two sources of max item level gear, being Savage Raids and your weekly tomestones. These weekly tomestones are most akin to Valor points in WoW. They are rewarded to you for completing max level content, with a weekly cap of 450 and gear items ranging from 375 tomestones to 1000. Only having two sources of max item level gear means that you can create clear best-in-slot gear sets and have the exact path to get them laid out in front of you. This is because Savage Raids are not purely gear drop based. Savage Raids drop treasure chests that contain a certain piece of gear, and you can open this chest on any class, and it will give you the raid gear piece for that specific class. For example, the final boss of a Savage Raid tier drops a weapon chest, and if you get the weapon chest, it's not a sword, or an axe, or a bow. It's whatever you want it to be, and you determine what weapon you'll get from it by opening it on the class that uses a particular weapon type. Even better is that clearing a Savage Raid fight gives you a currency once per week, specific to every single boss, and after acquiring enough of these boss-specific currencies, you can trade them for items that boss will drop. So after a certain amount of weeks, you are guaranteed to receive the item you're looking for. This means that you can accurately predict when you will get your best-in-slot items, how long it will take to upgrade them to max item level, and what specific pieces you're searching for. Lastly, a great benefit to a player like me who enjoys all types of games and not just FF14 is that logging out for days at a time doesn't mean that you fall behind. In World of Warcraft, when you are in a high-end Mythic raiding guild, it can feel like you have to grind out whatever expansion currency is required to power up your borrowed power system. I remember doing hundreds of mob souls runs in Legion to farm artifact power, grinding out islands in BFA for Azerite, and now, in Shadowlands, Torghast and Maw dailies. I hated feeling forced to play the game to farm some arbitrary currency for a system that will be invalidated in a patch. In FF14, the only things you have to care about on a weekly basis is your weekly raid lockout and tomestones. Tomestones, like I mentioned before, come from literally any piece of level 80 content, so you can do whatever you enjoy in the game and get rewarded. I don't have to do a specific activity that's super boring for some random currency that I don't care about. I can just do one dungeon per day and cap my tomestones over time. And guess what? When I have the tombstone gear I want for my main class, I can just stop capping my tomestones every week. The game allows you to choose what you want to do, how often you want to do it, and doesn't lock you into a system that requires upkeep, otherwise you fall behind. There have been times where I've logged out for weeks at a time while my raid team was taking a short break, and when I logged back in weeks later, I was at the same power level I left off at, and on par with everyone else. In the high-end raid community, it generally takes 8 weeks of raiding to get full best in slot. So after 8 weeks of re-clears, you have months to do whatever you want. Raid on an alt class because in FF you can have every class on the same character, farm mounts in extreme trials, tackle an ultimate and continue your raiding journey, or log out until the next raid releases. World of Warcraft always felt like it was designed for people who only play WoW. And while I love FF14 and have over 10,000 hours played, I still play other games every single day, and do not want to play FF all day every day. In closing, when I was moving away from WoW and drifting towards FF14, I was very skeptical if it could hold the attention of a more hardcore raider like myself. However, I 100% made the right decision moving over to 14, with Ultimate raiding breathing new life into the MMO genre for me. It gave me a goal to strive for, and required me to get better as a player, think deeper about the game, and push myself to be the best player I possibly could be. As long as FF14 keeps releasing ultimates, I'll keep playing. If you love challenging yourself and overcoming difficult bosses, then FF14 is 100% the game for you. Despite being focused on more casual content, there is still plenty of content for high-end raiders and people who enjoy being really good at the games they play. The speedrun community in 14 is huge, and competition is fierce. There is also a huge parsing community, and fighting for high percentiles is really fun. It can definitely get a bit repetitive when you're trying to be the best in the world, but what game isn't like that? If you're still on the fence about trying FF14, then I'd say give it a try. It starts really slow, and most people will try to tell you about how good the music is, or the story, or the glamour system, but for the gamers out there, unshowered, smelly, and sweaty raid gods, you have a home in 14. If you liked this video, leave a like. If you didn't, a dislike. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with my videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.